Lionel Ashford had been called barren, broken, and cursed by an alpha king who wore his cruelty like a crown. But when she walked into his precious pup ceremony 3 years later, with the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories at her side and an heir whose very existence made Darius's bloodline look like a genetic joke, she wasn't there to beg for forgiveness. She was there to watch him choke on his own arrogance. The invitation smelled like expensive paper and cheaper intentions. Lionel held it between 2 fingers, studying the ornate script as if it were a particularly venomous snake that had slithered onto her breakfast table. Black parchment. Gold ink. The silver claw crest pressed so deeply into the paper it had created tiny ridges she could feel with her thumb. Darius Thornridge never did anything halfway, especially not his cruelty. "You're going to set it on fire with your eyes," Cale said from across the room, his voice carrying that particular brand of amusement he reserved for moments when the universe revealed itself to be absurd. He was sprawling in the leather chair by the window, their son Aiden dozing against his chest, one tiny fist wrapped around his father's finger. "I'm considering it," Lionel replied, setting the invitation down before she actually did burn a hole through it with the force of her glare. "Listen to this. The Alpha King of Silverclaw Pack and his mate, Lady Isabel Ravencrest, request the honor of your presence at the pup ceremony celebrating the birth of their heirs, Prince Nathaniel and Princess Cordelia Thornridge." She looked up. "He wants me at his children's naming ceremony." "How magnanimous," Cale drawled, his dark eyes glinting with something between murder and mirth. "And what does the rest say?" Lionel picked up the invitation again, her jaw tightening. "Your presence would honor us on this joyous occasion, as we celebrate the continuation of the Thornridge bloodline and the strengthening of pack bonds across the Northern Territories. It's signed by both of them, Darius and Isabel." "She probably doesn't even know who you are," Cale observed, adjusting Aiden's position slightly. Their son made a small sound of protest but didn't wake. At 6 months old, he already had his father's stubborn streak and his mother's tendency to sleep through chaos. "I doubt Darius advertised his previous failures." "Failures?" Lionel laughed, but it came out bitter. "That's what I was, wasn't I? His great failure. The mate who couldn't produce heirs. The woman whose womb was apparently too cursed to carry the precious Thornridge legacy." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The Blood Moon estate sprawled below them, all dark stone and ancient forests. It was nothing like Silverclaw's gleaming marble and manicured gardens. Cale's territory looked like something out of a legend, beautiful in a way that suggested teeth and danger. She'd grown to love it, this place that felt more honest than anywhere she'd ever lived. "He rejected you in front of the entire Northern Council," Cale said quietly, his tone losing its amusement. "Declared you barren and broken. Severed your mate bond with theatrical precision and sent you away with nothing but your shame. And now he invites you to watch him celebrate his new family." "To mock me," Lionel said flatly, watching clouds gather over the forest. "To parade his success in front of my failure. To prove to everyone that he was right to reject me and that he's moved on to better things. Has it occurred to you," Cale said slowly, "that he doesn't know?" Lionel turned to look at him. Aiden had shifted in his sleep, his small face pressed against Cale's chest, completely secure in his father's arms. The sight made something warm and fierce unfold in her chest. "Doesn't know what?" "That you have a son." Cale's smile was sharp enough to cut. "News travels slowly when you don't want it to travel at all. We've kept Aiden's existence quiet. Only the Blood Moon clan knows, and they're loyal to their bones. As far as the Northern Territories are concerned, you disappeared 3 years ago. Faded into obscurity. Exactly what Darius wanted." Lionel felt her heart start to beat faster. "You think he still believes I'm barren?" "I think," Cale said carefully, "that Darius Thornridge is about to host the most important ceremony of his political career. Every alpha in the Northern Territories will be there. Every elder, every pack leader, every wolf of consequence. He's showing off his heirs, proving his bloodline is strong, cementing his position as Alpha King." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "And he invited you because he thinks you're harmless. A cautionary tale. A ghost from his past who serves to make his present look even brighter. He invited me to humiliate me," Lionel whispered. He did, Cale agreed. Which is why you're going to go. Lionel stared at him. You want me to walk into that? Into his ceremony, his pack, his territory? Surrounded by people who watched him reject me. I want you to walk in with your head high and our son in your arms, Cale said, standing slowly, careful not to wake Aiden. I want you to show every wolf in that hall what a real heir looks like. What real power smells like. What Darius Thornridge was too blind and too stupid to recognize. He crossed to her, Aiden still sleeping peacefully against his shoulder. Up close, Lionel could see the ancient power that ran through both of them, father and son, old bloodline and older magic. Aiden's small chest rose and fell with breaths that already carried hints of alpha strength. His tiny fingers, curled in sleep, would one day command armies. The lunar-born gift that lived in her had found its match in Cale's bloodline, and the result was devastating. He called you Barren, Cale said softly, his free hand cupping her face. He declared you broken in front of everyone who mattered. He made you believe you were the problem. I was the problem, Lionel said, old pain making her voice crack. For 3 years, I couldn't. You were never the problem, Cale interrupted, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. His bloodline was incompatible. Magically, genetically, fundamentally wrong for you. You carry the gift of the lunar-born, Lionel. You needed a mate descended from the first wolves. Darius Thornridge's bloodline is about as ancient as last week's bread. He couldn't have gotten you pregnant if he'd tried for a century. Lionel had heard this before, but hearing it still felt like having a weight lifted from her chest. He doesn't know that. He doesn't know that, Cale confirmed. And when you walk into his ceremony with proof that you were never the failure he claimed you were, it's going to destroy him. Aiden stirred, making a small sound. His eyes opened, already that distinctive nightshade silver, and focused on his mother. He reached for her with chubby arms, and Lionel took him, holding him close. He smelled like milk and magic, innocent and powerful all at once. He's going to hate us, Lionel said quietly, kissing her son's forehead. He already hates you, Cale pointed out. The difference is, after this, he's going to have to live with knowing he was wrong. That he rejected a mate who was extraordinary. That his bloodline is ordinary. That he threw away something priceless because he was too arrogant to question his own limitations. Lionel looked down at the invitation again. The pup ceremony. A celebration of heirs and bloodlines and pack legacy. Darius would be in his element, surrounded by admirers, basking in his success. He would see her walk in and feel smug. Vindicated. Proven right. Until he saw Aiden. When is it? She asked. 3 weeks, Cale said. The spring equinox. Same timing as when he rejected you, actually. He does love his symbolic dates. 3 weeks. Enough time to prepare. Enough time to make sure her arrival would be remembered. I'll need a dress, Lionel said slowly, a smile starting to form. Not a happy smile. Something darker. Something that tasted like vindication and felt like justice. Something that makes it clear I'm not there to apologize. I'll have the tailors summoned, Cale said, matching her smile. And I'll wear the very formal cloak. The one that makes other alphas nervous. The one that makes other alphas remember why the Blood Moon clan has held power for 3,000 years, Cale corrected. Lionel looked at her son, at her mate, at the invitation that was supposed to be her humiliation. 3 years ago, she'd left Silverclaw broken and ashamed, believing she was everything they'd said she was. Barren. Cursed. Worthless. 3 years later, she was going back. And Darius Thornridge was going to learn the difference between power and posturing. The seamstress took one look at Lionel and declared her a canvas worthy of warfare. You want to make a statement, the elderly woman said, circling Lionel like a predator assessing prey. Her name was Miriam, and she'd been dressing Blood Moon royalty for 60 years. Her fingers were gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. Not just any statement. You want to walk into that hall and make every wolf question their reality. Exactly, Lionel confirmed, standing straighter. Aiden was with Cale in the next room, probably being taught something inappropriately advanced for a 6-month-old, like battle strategy or the proper way to intimidate lesser alphas with a glance. Miriam hummed, pulling out swaths of fabric that shimmered like moonlight on water. The rejected mate returns. It's like something out of the old stories, except those usually end in blood and prophecy. She paused, holding up a deep burgundy silk. This one ends in blood and prophecy too, doesn't it? I'm just attending a ceremony, Lionel said innocently. And I'm just a seamstress, Miriam replied, her tone dripping with sarcasm that could dissolve steel. We're both liars, dear. The difference is, my lies result in beautiful dresses. Yours will result in a political earthquake. She set aside the burgundy and pulled out something darker. Midnight blue, almost black, with threads of silver woven through like starlight. This is the color of reckoning. Lionel touched the fabric. It felt alive beneath her fingers, expensive and dangerous. It's perfect. Of course it is. I've been doing this since before your rejected mate's grandfather was born. Miriam began taking measurements, her hands quick and efficient despite their appearance. I dressed the last Luna who walked into enemy territory wearing her dignity like armor. She'd been exiled, you see. Falsely accused of treason. When she returned 15 years later with proof of her innocence and an army at her back, she wore midnight blue. What happened to the alpha who exiled her? Miriam's smile was thin and satisfied. He abdicated within a month. Couldn't handle the shame. Spent the rest of his life in a monastery, probably praying the moon goddess would let him forget what an idiot he'd been. She marked a measurement on Lionel's shoulder. Men like that, the ones who mistake their own inadequacy for someone else's failure, they don't handle truth well. Lionel thought of Darius practicing his disappointed face in the mirror. Of the monthly fertility assessments that had felt more like interrogations. Of Elder Moira declaring her touched by shadow while Darius stood there, nodding along like a puppet whose strings were pulled by other people's opinions. He really believed it was my fault, Lionel said quietly. That I was the broken one. Of course he did, Miriam replied, her tone matter-of-fact. Believing otherwise would require him to question himself. Alpha kings don't do that. They'd rather burn the world than admit they might be wrong. She stepped back, assessing her work. But you know what's funny about fire? What? It doesn't care about titles. It burns everyone equally. Miriam pulled out a sketch pad and began drawing with quick, precise strokes. Your dress will have a high collar. Regal but not apologetic. Long sleeves to hide the rejection scars on your wrists, not because you're ashamed, but because they're none of his business anymore. The skirt will move like water when you walk. Every step will look like a choice, not a stumble. Lionel watched the design take shape. It was beautiful and brutal, elegant and unforgiving. When you walk into that ceremony, Miriam continued, not looking up from her sketch, you won't look like someone who came to beg. You'll look like someone who came to collect a debt. She added a final detail, a silver clasp at the collar shaped like a crescent moon. And when he sees your son, when he realizes what he rejected, what he lost, what he'll never have, that's when the dress will matter. Because you won't be wearing the clothes of a victim. You'll be wearing the armor of a woman who survived his cruelty and came back stronger. Lionel felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Miriam said, finally looking up with a smile that was part grandmother, part general. Thank me after you've destroyed him. Then we'll share wine and talk about how men are consistently disappointing. 3 weeks suddenly felt both too long and not long enough. Training a 6-month-old to attend a formal ceremony was, Lionel discovered, like trying to negotiate with a very small, very powerful dictator who communicated primarily through screaming and the strategic deployment of bodily fluids. He needs to be presentable, Lionel said, attempting to wrestle Aiden into a tiny formal outfit that Kale had commissioned. The baby responded by grabbing her hair and yanking with the strength of someone who definitely had alpha genetics. Aiden, please. We've discussed this. You're discussing fashion with an infant, Kale observed from the doorway, looking far too amused for someone who was supposed to be helping. I'm not sure he's grasped the political implications of his wardrobe choices. He's grasped my hair, Lionel muttered. carefully extricating herself from Aiden's surprisingly strong grip. Their son looked up at her with wide silver eyes that were far too innocent for someone who'd just attempted to scalp his own mother. And he keeps spitting up on anything expensive. He has standards, Cale said, crossing the room to take Aiden from her arms. The baby immediately calmed, settling against his father's chest with a satisfied gurgle that sounded suspiciously smug. He's making a statement about wealth inequality. He's 6 months old. A very politically conscious 6 months old. Cale held up the tiny formal jacket, examining it with the seriousness of someone analyzing battle armor. Though I admit, this is excessive. Who puts gold buttons on baby clothes? You commissioned it, Lionel pointed out. I commissioned something that would make other alphas uncomfortable. There's a difference. He looked at Aiden, who was now attempting to eat the jacket's collar. What do you think, son? Too much. Aiden's response was to sneeze directly onto the gold buttons. He votes no, Cale translated. Lionel collapsed onto the bed, laughing despite herself. 3 weeks had passed in a blur of preparations, dress fittings, and increasingly absurd arguments about infant fashion. Tomorrow, they would leave for Silverclaw. Tomorrow, she would face Darius again. Tomorrow, everything would change. The laughter died in her throat. Hey, Cale said softly, sitting beside her with Aiden still in his arms. What's wrong? What if this is a mistake? Lionel whispered, staring at her hands. The rejection scars on her wrists had faded over time, but she could still feel them like phantom burns. What if walking in there just opens old wounds? What if I'm not strong enough to face him? Then you lean on me, Cale said simply. That's what mates do. But what if seeing him makes me remember? She broke off, unable to finish the sentence. Remember how much she'd loved him. Remember how completely she'd believed his rejection meant she was worthless. Remember the pain of having her soul torn apart while an audience watched. Cale shifted Aiden to one arm and used his free hand to tilt Lionel's face toward his. Listen to me. Darius Thornridge is a mediocre man with an excellent publicist. He's got a fancy title and a marble palace, but underneath all that performance, he's just a frightened boy playing king. You know why he rejected you publicly? Lionel shook her head. Because he needed witnesses to validate his cruelty. He needed other people to agree with him, to confirm that yes, you were the problem, not him. That's not strength, Lionel. That's cowardice dressed in ceremonial robes. He humiliated me. He tried to, Cale corrected. But humiliation only works if you accept the narrative. You didn't. You survived. You built a new life. You found a mate who actually deserves you. You created a son who will be more powerful than Darius could ever dream of being. He pressed his forehead to hers, Aiden squirming between them. Tomorrow, you're not walking into his territory as his rejected mate. You're walking in as Luna of Bloodmoon, mother to the next Nightshade heir, and a woman who knows her worth. What if I forget that when I see him? Then look at Aiden, Cale said. And remember what you're really showing him. Not that you've moved on. Not that you've found better. You're showing him the truth he spent 3 years running from, that he was never good enough for you in the first place. Aiden chose that moment to grab both their faces with his small hands, squishing their cheeks together with delighted laughter. See? Cale said, his voice muffled. Our son agrees. And he's never wrong. He's 6 months old. A very wise 6 months old. Lionel looked at her son, at her mate, at the life she'd built from the ashes of her rejection. Tomorrow, she would face her past. But tonight, she had her future in her arms, sprawled in geometrically precise patterns, as if nature itself had been bullied into compliance. Even the fountain in the courtyard seemed to flow with more elegance than necessary, water cascading over stone wolves frozen mid-howl in what Darius probably thought was inspiring but really just looked like expensive taxidermy. It's very white, Cale observed as their carriage rolled through the gates. He was wearing the very formal cloak, black as midnight with silver embroidery that seemed to move in patterns too complex to follow. On anyone else, it would have looked like trying too hard. On Cale, it looked like a warning. Darius believes white represents purity, Lionel said, adjusting Aiden's outfit for the 100th time. Her son was being remarkably well-behaved, which made her suspicious. 6-month-olds didn't do well-behaved without ulterior motives. He had the entire East Wing repainted 3 times to get the exact shade he wanted. Of course he did. Kale peered out the window at the gathering crowd. Wolves from every major pack were arriving in carriages that ranged from modest to absolutely ridiculous. One alpha had apparently decided to arrive in something that looked like a mobile palace. I see subtlety is dead and we're all here for the funeral. Lionel laughed despite her nerves. Her dress, Miriam's masterpiece, fit like it had been grown rather than sewn, the midnight blue fabric catching the light in ways that made her look like she'd been dipped in starlight. The high collar hid her rejection scars, but more importantly, it made her look like someone who had nothing to apologize for. Ready? Kale asked, and there was no amusement in his voice now. Just quiet strength and absolute certainty. No, Lionel admitted. But let's do this anyway. They descended from the carriage, and Lionel felt the moment the crowd noticed them. Conversations stuttered. Heads turned. Someone dropped what sounded like an entire tray of glasses. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the courtyard like wildfire. Is that? It can't be. She came back. Who's the alpha with her? Is that a baby? Lionel kept her head high, one hand holding Aiden securely against her hip, the other resting on Kale's arm. They walked toward the entrance like they owned the place, which was appropriate because Kale's bloodline had been ruling territories when Silverclaw was still a collection of huts and wishful thinking. Elder Moira appeared in their path like a disapproving wall. She looked older, more weathered, her face set in lines that suggested she'd spent 3 years being consistently disappointed by everything. Lionel Ashford, she said, her voice carrying across the courtyard. I'm surprised to see you here. Are you? Lionel replied coolly. I was invited. By mistake, surely. Moira's eyes narrowed, flicking to Kale and then to Aiden. You were released from this pack. Your presence is inappropriate. My invitation suggests otherwise. Lionel shifted Aiden slightly, and several nearby wolves gasped as they got their first clear look at him. Silver eyes. Dark hair already showing signs of the Nightshade bloodline. Power radiating from him even in sleep. Unless you're suggesting your Alpha King doesn't mean what he writes. Moira's face went through several interesting colors. That child is my son, Lionel said, her voice dropping to something dangerous. And if you finish that sentence with anything other than a compliment, Elder Moira, you and I are going to have a very different conversation than the one you're imagining. The old woman stepped back, and Lionel felt a surge of vicious satisfaction. 3 years ago, she would have cowered under Moira's disapproval. 3 years ago, she would have believed she deserved the scorn. 3 years ago, she was a different woman. Lionel, a new voice called, and Lionel's stomach clenched. She knew that voice. Had loved that voice. Had heard it declare her worthless in front of everyone who mattered. Darius Thornridge stepped out of the entrance, and Lionel's first thought was that he looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically, he was still tall, still built like someone who spent more time in the gym than dealing with actual problems. But his presence, which had once seemed overwhelming, now felt manufactured. Like he was performing the role of Alpha King rather than actually being one. He stopped dead when he saw her. Lionel, he repeated, and his voice cracked slightly on her name. His eyes went to Kale, widened, then dropped to Aiden. She watched emotions flicker across his perfect face, confusion, shock, disbelief, and something that looked uncomfortably like horror. Darius, Lionel said pleasantly, as if they were old friends catching up at a dinner party rather than former mates meeting after a devastating rejection. Thank you for the invitation. Your ceremony sounds lovely. He seemed to be struggling with basic language. His eyes kept darting back to Aiden, who had woken up and was watching Darius with the intense stare babies used when deciding whether someone was worth their attention. You have a child. I do, Lionel confirmed. This is Aiden. Aiden, this is, well, his nobody important. Kale made a sound that might have been a cough or might have been suppressed laughter. Darius's face flushed red. But you're barren, the healers said. The healers were wrong, Lionel interrupted, her voice calm and clear and carrying across a courtyard that had gone absolutely silent. Every wolf present was now watching this exchange with the kind of attention usually reserved for declarations of war. Turns out, I just needed the right mate. Someone whose bloodline was actually compatible with mine. Someone descended from the first wolves rather than, she paused delicately. Well, rather than bureaucrats who married into titles. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. The kind that crushed. Darius looked like he'd been slapped with a frozen fish and then asked to explain quantum physics. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No sound came out. Shall we go in? Cale suggested pleasantly, his hand tightening supportively on Lionel's waist. I believe there's a ceremony starting soon. Something about celebrating heirs and bloodlines. Should be educational. They walked past Darius, past Elder Moira, past the crowd of shocked wolves who were already pulling out their phones to spread this gossip to every corner of the Northern Territories. Behind them, Lionel heard Darius finally find his voice. Wait. But she didn't stop. Didn't look back. Just kept walking into the palace that had once been meant to be her home, wearing her midnight blue dress like armor and carrying her son like a crown. Let him wait. She'd waited 3 years. He could wait 3 minutes. The ceremonial hall was a monument to excess masquerading as taste. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings like frozen tears, each one probably costing more than most wolves earned in a year. The walls were covered in tapestries depicting Thornridge victories that Lionel suspected had been significantly embellished. She distinctly remembered hearing that the Battle of Frost Creek had involved far less heroism and far more accidentally setting their own camp on fire. Wolves from every major pack filled the room, dressed in their finest, all trying to outformal each other in a competition nobody had officially declared but everyone was definitely participating in. The air smelled like expensive perfume, political ambition, and anxiety masked as confidence. It's like walking into a museum dedicated to insecurity, Cale murmured, guiding Lionel toward their assigned seats. Which, she noticed with dark amusement, were in the back. Far from the dais where Darius would present his heirs. A subtle reminder of her former place in the hierarchy, forgotten, irrelevant, erased. Except now, every wolf in the room was staring at her. Is that really her? Someone whispered behind her. With a baby. And Cale Nightshade. The Blood Moon Alpha. I heard she was barren. Clearly not. Lionel settled into her seat, arranging Aiden comfortably in her lap. Her son was being remarkably patient, his silver eyes taking in the spectacle with what looked like infant judgment. She couldn't blame him. If she were 6 months old and forced to attend this performance, she'd probably start screaming on principle. How are you feeling? Cale asked quietly, his hand finding hers. Like I'm sitting in a room full of people who watched me get destroyed and did nothing, Lionel admitted. And like half of them are currently re-evaluating their entire understanding of reality. Good, Cale said simply. Let them re-evaluate. Let them question. Let them realize they stood by while an alpha king committed one of the oldest injustices, blaming his mate for his own inadequacy. A woman approached their row, her expression caught somewhere between curiosity and calculation. Lady Vivienne of the Riverside Pack, Lionel recognized. She'd been at the rejection ceremony, had stood silent while Darius severed the mate bond, had probably gone home and gossiped about the Barren Luna over expensive wine. Lionel, Vivienne said, her voice saccharine. What a surprise to see you here. And with such company. Her eyes raked over Cale with barely disguised interest before dropping to Aiden. Your child is beautiful. Thank you, Lionel replied, her tone perfectly neutral. I had heard you'd left the Northern Territories entirely, Vivienne continued, settling into a seat nearby without being invited. After the unpleasantness with Alpha Darius. We all felt so terrible for you. Did you? Lionel asked, and watched Vivienne smile falter. I don't recall anyone speaking up when he called me Barren in front of the entire council. Or when Elder Moira declared me cursed. Or when his mother called me the mistake. Vivienne's face flushed. Well, we couldn't exactly, it wasn't our place to. To what? Cale interrupted, his voice silk over steel. To defend someone being publicly humiliated. To question an alpha who was blaming his mate for what was clearly his own inadequacy. To show even the smallest amount of courage or integrity. Several nearby wolves suddenly became very interested in their programs. Vivienne stood abruptly, mumbling something about finding her seat, and fled. Lionel watched her go and felt something fierce and satisfied unfurl in her chest. You know what the worst part is? She said quietly. Half these wolves probably knew something was wrong. They're old enough to remember the stories about bloodline compatibility. But nobody said anything because contradicting an alpha king was inconvenient. Welcome to pack politics, Cale said dryly. Where truth takes a backseat to convenience and everyone's more concerned with their position than their principles. A gong sounded, deep and resonant, and the hall fell silent. Lionel's heart began to beat faster. The ceremony was beginning. Darius entered first, and Lionel had to admit he knew how to make an entrance. He wore white and gold, his alpha aura radiating outward like a peacock displaying feathers. He looked regal, powerful, every inch the alpha king. Behind him came Lady Isabel Ravencrest, his new mate, carrying 2 infants in elaborate ceremonial wrapping. Isabel was beautiful in the way expensive jewelry was beautiful, carefully curated, precisely presented, and somehow cold despite all the warm colors she wore. Her smile looked painted on as she walked beside Darius, her airs held with the careful attention of someone handling valuable but breakable property. They ascended the dais, and Darius raised his hands for silence he already had. Wolves of the Northern Territories, he began, his voice carrying across the hall with practiced perfection. Today we celebrate not just the birth of my children, but the continuation of a bloodline that has served these lands for generations. Today we honor tradition, strength, and the future of our kind. Lionel felt Aidan shift in her arms. Her son was watching Darius with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so young, his small face serious. These heirs, Darius continued, gesturing to the infants Isabel held, represent everything we value as wolves. Pure bloodlines. Strong heritage. The promise of leadership for generations to come. Cale leaned close to Lionel's ear. He's really committing to this pure bloodline narrative, isn't he? Someone should tell him that his great-grandfather was a clerk who married an alpha's daughter. His bloodline is about as pure as a political compromise. Lionel bit her lip to keep from laughing. Let me be clear, Darius said, and his eyes swept the crowd before landing on Lionel. She felt the impact like a physical thing, his gaze heavy with meaning. A Luna's primary duty is to provide strong heirs. Without that, there is no future. Without that, he paused dramatically. There is nothing. The message was clear. He was talking about her. Reminding everyone why he'd rejected her. Justifying his cruelty by framing it as necessity. Several wolves glanced at Lionel, probably expecting her to look ashamed. To shrink. To prove Darius's point by her very presence. Instead, she stood. The entire hall turned to look at her. Aidan, sensing something important was happening, made a small sound and grabbed a fistful of her dress. I have a question, Lionel said, her voice clear and calm and carrying easily across the suddenly silent hall. About bloodlines and compatibility. Since you're such an expert on the subject, Alpha King, perhaps you could educate us all. Darius's face went carefully blank. This is not the time. When is the time? Lionel interrupted, taking a step into the aisle. Cale stood beside her, a silent pillar of support. You're giving a speech about the importance of strong bloodlines. About lunar duties. About heirs and heritage. Surely you can spare a moment for clarification. She watched his jaw tighten. Watched him calculate. He couldn't throw her out, not without looking like a tyrant. Couldn't silence her, not without admitting he was afraid of what she might say. What is your question? He finally asked, each word sounding like it cost him. Lionel smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Does bloodline compatibility matter, she asked, or only when it's convenient to your narrative? The silence that followed was absolute. And in that silence, Aidan laughed, a bright, clear baby laugh that echoed through the ceremonial hall like a bell tolling truth. Darius looked like a man who'd just realized he was standing on a trapdoor and someone was reaching for the lever. "I don't understand your question," he said carefully, his politician's smile fixed in place like a mask that might crack at any moment. The two infants in Isabel's arms began to fuss, sensing the tension in the room the way babies always did, their small faces scrunching up in preparation for crying. "It's simple," Lionel said, taking another step forward. Aiden was perfectly calm in her arms, watching the proceedings with those unsettling silver eyes that seemed to see more than a 6-month-old should. "You rejected me because I couldn't provide heirs. You declared me barren in front of the Northern Council. You severed our mate bond because, and I'm quoting you here, a mate who cannot bear heirs is no mate at all." Several wolves shifted uncomfortably. Elder Moira had gone pale. Lady Vivienne was staring at her hands like they contained the secrets of the universe. "That was," Darius started, but Lionel wasn't finished. "But here's what's interesting," she continued, her voice conversational, almost friendly. "I'm not barren. I never was. I have a son. A healthy, strong son who's already showing signs of alpha power that most wolves don't develop until adolescence." She held Aiden up slightly, and her son grabbed her finger, his small hand glowing faintly with inherited magic that made several elders gasp. "So either I spontaneously stopped being barren after you rejected me, which would suggest the moon goddess has a deeply ironic sense of humor, or the problem was never mine to begin with." The silence in the hall had weight now, pressure, like a storm gathering strength. "Bloodline compatibility," Cale said, stepping forward to stand beside Lionel. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from 3,000 years of unbroken lineage. "It's one of the oldest laws of our kind. Certain gifts require certain bloodlines to manifest. The lunar-born, for example." He gestured to Lionel. "They can only conceive with alphas descended from the first wolves. It's not a choice. It's not a failure. It's genetics and magic combined." Darius's face had gone from pale to flushed. "That's ancient superstition." "Is it?" An elderly alpha stood from his seat near the front. Lionel recognized him, Alpha Theodore of the Stormwatch Pack, one of the oldest wolves in the Northern Territories. His voice cracked with age but carried undeniable weight. "I remember the old teachings. My grandmother spoke of the lunar-born. Said they appeared once every few generations, always female, always powerful. Said they needed mates from the original bloodlines or their gifts would remain dormant." "Exactly," another voice called out. A woman this time, standing from the middle section. "My great-aunt was lunar-born. She was declared barren by 3 different mates before she found one with first wolf blood. She had 7 children, all of them extraordinary." More voices joined in, wolves standing throughout the hall, sharing stories that had been dismissed as legends, as superstition, as convenient excuses. The whispers built like thunder. Darius held up his hands, trying to regain control. "Even if such a thing exists, and I'm not conceding that it does, how do we know Lionel possesses this supposed gift?" "Because," Cale said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade, "the lunar-born carry a specific scent marker. Most wolves can't detect it. But alphas of the old bloodlines can. It smells like moonlight and starfire and ancient power." He turned to face the crowd. "Any alpha here descended from the first wolves will be able to confirm it. They'll scent her and know immediately what she is." Alpha Theodore was already moving toward them, his ancient joints creaking. He approached Lionel slowly, respectfully, and breathed in. His eyes widened. "Moon's mercy," he whispered. "She is. She's lunar-born. I can smell it now that I know what I'm looking for. How did we miss this?" "Because nobody was looking," Lionel said quietly. "Because it was easier to believe I was broken than to question whether the problem might lie elsewhere." More alphas were standing now, those from old families, ancient lineages. They came forward one by one, scented her, confirmed what Alpha Theodore had found. Each confirmation was another nail in Darius's carefully constructed narrative. Elder Moira looked like she might faint. "But we tested her. The healers examined her thoroughly." "Your healers tested for common fertility issues," Cale interrupted. They burned herbs and consulted outdated texts. They never tested for bloodline compatibility because that would have required them to question their Alpha King's heritage. He turned to Darius, his smile sharp and merciless. "Tell me, Darius Thornridge, how far back does your bloodline trace? To the first wolves? To the original packs?" Darius's silence was answer enough. "Your great-grandfather was a merchant," Alpha Theodore said slowly, memory dawning on his weathered face. "I remember now. He married into the Thornridge line. Brought considerable wealth but no magical heritage. Your bloodline is powerful in politics and resources, but magically." He shook his head. "You're compatible with most wolves. But not with Luna-born. You never could have gotten her pregnant. It would be like trying to grow roses in sand." The metaphor was mixed but the point was clear. Isabel had gone very still on the dais, her face unreadable as she processed what was being revealed. The twins in her arms were crying openly now, their wails filling the ceremonial hall like a soundtrack to Darius's unraveling. "So let me see if I understand," Lyanna said, and her voice was steady despite the emotions churning in her chest. "You rejected me, called me barren, severed our mate bond in front of everyone, sent me away with nothing but shame. And you did all of this because you were too arrogant to consider that the problem might be your bloodline, not mine." Darius's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Lyanna corrected. "You didn't question. You didn't investigate. You just assumed. And when your assumptions proved convenient for you, when they gave you an excuse to find a new mate who might be politically advantageous," she glanced at Isabel, who was staring at Darius with dawning horror. "You made those assumptions public truth." "This is my ceremony," Darius said, his voice rising, control slipping. "You come here, to my pack, to my territory, and try to undermine me." "I came because you invited me," Lyanna reminded him. "Or did you forget? You sent me a beautifully written invitation on expensive paper, requesting my presence to honor you and your heirs. What did you think would happen, Darius? That I'd sit quietly in the back and watch you celebrate while remembering how you destroyed me?" Aiden chose that moment to reach toward Darius, his small hand stretching out, and power rippled from him. Visible, undeniable, raw magical inheritance that made the chandeliers overhead swing and the flames in the ceremonial braziers flare bright. Every wolf in the hall felt it. The weight of old magic, ancient bloodlines, the kind of power that appeared once in generations. The kind of power Darius's heirs would never possess. "That's what you rejected," Kale said quietly, gesturing to Aiden. "That's what you called worthless. That's what you deemed unworthy of the Thornridge name." Darius stared at Aiden with an expression Lyanna couldn't quite read. Loss, regret, or just wounded pride at being proven catastrophically wrong in front of everyone who mattered. She didn't care which it was. She'd gotten what she came for. The aftermath of truth was always messier than the revelation itself. Darius stood on his dais, surrounded by the ruins of his carefully constructed narrative, looking like a king whose crown had just been revealed as painted cardboard. Isabel had quietly descended the steps, twins still in her arms, her face a mask of polite fury that promised a very private, very brutal conversation later. The wolves in the hall were talking openly now, no longer bothering with whispers, their voices building into a cacophony of shock and speculation. "I think," Kale said pleasantly, "that we've stayed long enough. What do you think, love?" Lyanna looked at Darius one last time. 3 years ago, this man had represented everything she'd wanted. Power, prestige, belonging. She'd loved him with a desperation that made her ignore every warning sign, every red flag, every moment of cruelty disguised as disappointment. Now, looking at him, she felt nothing but pity. "I think you're right," she said, adjusting Aiden in her arms. Her son had fallen asleep despite the chaos, his small face peaceful against her chest. "We should go home." They turned to leave, and the crowd parted like water, wolves stepping aside to create a clear path. Some faces showed respect. Others showed calculation, already wondering how to benefit from this shift in power dynamics. A few showed genuine remorse, as if they'd just realized they'd stood by while injustice wore a crown. "Lyanna, wait." Darius's voice was rough, stripped of its usual polish. She stopped but didn't turn around. I didn't know. You have to believe I didn't know about bloodline compatibility. I believe you, Lionel said to the heir in front of her. You didn't know because you never bothered to ask. You didn't know because questioning yourself was harder than blaming me. You didn't know because knowing would have required you to be someone you're not, someone humble enough to admit they might be wrong. She turned then, meeting his eyes across the ceremonial hall. But here's what I know, Darius. I know that I survived your rejection. I know that I found a mate who sees my worth instead of my utility. I know that I have a son who will grow up understanding that strength isn't about being right, it's about having the courage to question yourself when you're wrong. She smiled, and it was genuine this time, not sharp or vindictive, just honest. I hope your children learn that lesson. I hope you learn it. But either way, it's no longer my problem. She walked out of the Silverclaw estate with her head high, Cale's hand warm against her back, Aiden sleeping peacefully in her arms. Behind her, she heard the whispers start again, building into conversations that would spread across the Northern Territories by nightfall. The rejected Barren mate who wasn't barren at all. The Alpha King who blamed his mate for his own inadequacy. The ceremony that became a reckoning. It would make a good story, Lionel thought. The kind people told for generations. But for her, it was just the beginning. 3 years ago, Darius Thornridge had tried to write her ending. Today, she'd taken back her pen. And the story she was writing now, with Cale beside her and Aiden in her arms and a future that belonged entirely to her, that was the one that mattered. The rest was just noise. They climbed into their carriage as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Aiden stirred, opened his silver eyes, and smiled up at his mother with pure, uncomplicated love. Let's go home, Lionel said. And they did. Asterisk if you believe mates should be valued for who they are, not what they can provide, and if you think alphas like Darius who blame others for their own inadequacies deserve to be exposed, hit that subscribe button. Only people who think humiliation is acceptable leadership won't subscribe. Comment below, Team Lionel or Team Darius. Let's see who's brave enough to defend him. Asterisk.